Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget. The barracks were unusually quiet for a military outpost, save for the faint hum of jungle insects outside. Private Jack Whitaker, a fresh recruit, had been stationed at the remote base deep in the heart of the jungle. The air smelled of mildew and sweat, a damp reminder of how far they were from civilization. Assigned to cleaning duty, Jack grumbled as he shuffled through the barracks, broom in hand. Dust motes danced in the streaks of sunlight slipping through the broken shutters. As he swept under a forgotten bunk in the far corner, something metallic clinked against the wood. Curious, Jack crouched down and pulled out an old, tarnished dog tag. The name etched onto it was barely legible, dulled by time and grime. Squinting, he read, "Private James Calhoun." Calhoun? Never heard of him, Jack muttered, flipping the dog tag over. The identification number was still visible, but the edges were corroded. Shrugging, he placed the tag on his bunk and resumed cleaning. That night, as the barracks filled with the snores and murmurs of exhausted soldiers, Jack lay awake. He kept glancing at the dog tag on the small shelf near his bed. It seemed innocuous enough, but something about it unsettled him. The next morning, Jack woke to find the dog tag sitting on his chest, cold and heavy. Startled, he sat up, clutching the tag. He distinctly remembered leaving it on the shelf. "Very funny, guys," he muttered, looking around at the others, who were still asleep. He tossed the tag into his foot locker and slammed it shut, the metallic sound echoing in the room. The day passed uneventfully, but an odd sensation lingered, like he was being watched. Shadows seemed to stretch and shift in the corners of the barracks, and at times, Jack thought he heard faint whispers, too soft to make out. That night, he was determined to sleep without interruption. But, as he lay in the dark, the whispers returned, louder now, as if coming from just beyond his bunk. "Who's there?" Jack called out, his voice shaky. No response. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint sound of metal clinking. Heart pounding, Jack reached for his flashlight and scanned the room. The dog tag was on his bed again, sitting in the exact center of his pillow. This time, a chill ran through Jack's body. He knew he had locked it away. How had it gotten out? "Who are you?" Jack whispered into the darkness. The shadows in the room seemed to deepen, and for a moment, Jack thought he saw movement near the far corner of the barracks. But when he shone his flashlight, there was nothing there. Clutching the dog tag, Jack resolved to find out who James Calhoun was and why his name and his presence still lingered in the barracks. The next day, Jack couldn't shake the unease from the previous night. He sat in the mess hall, poking at his breakfast, while his bunkmate, Corporal Dean Ramirez, cracked jokes about the latest round of drills. "Whitaker, you look like you've seen a ghost," Dean said, smirking. "What's got you spooked?" Jack hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Lowering his voice, he said, "I found an old dog tag yesterday. It keeps showing up on my bed, even after I locked it away." Dean raised an eyebrow, then shrugged. "Probably someone messing with you. Relax, rookie. These old bases are full of weird stuff left behind. Don't let your imagination run wild." But Jack wasn't convinced. The whispers, the shifting shadows, those weren't pranks. He decided to dig deeper. That afternoon, during a break, Jack approached the base's quartermaster, Sergeant Harris, a grizzled veteran who had been stationed there for decades. "Sergeant," Jack began, pulling the dog tag from his pocket. "Do you know anything about a Private James Calhoun?" Harris squinted at the tag, his weathered face growing somber. "Where'd you find this?" "Under one of the bunks in the barracks," Jack replied. "Why?" Harris sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Calhoun was stationed here years ago, during the height of the conflict. Good soldier, but he went missing one night during a patrol. Never found a trace of him. Some say he got lost in the jungle. Others, well, they had different theories. What kind of theories? Jack pressed. Superstition. Mostly, Harris said, avoiding Jack's gaze. They claimed the jungle wasn't just dangerous because of the enemy. They said it had ... something else. Something that took Calhoun. After he disappeared, strange things started happening. Whispers, shadows, things moving on their own. Jack felt a cold sweat on his back. Why didn't they shut down the base? Harris chuckled darkly. War doesn't wait for ghost stories, son. The brass didn't care. Soldiers die every day. Calhoun was just another name on the list? That night, Jack couldn't sleep. Harris's words haunted him as much as the whispers. He lay in his bunk, clutching the dog tag, when he noticed something strange. The air had grown colder, and the faint scent of damp earth and metal filled the room. A low murmur began, barely audible but unmistakable. Jack sat up, his heart racing. Who's there? The murmurs grew louder, forming fragmented words. Help lost forgotten. Jack turned on his flashlight, scanning the room. The beam flickered as if the battery were dying, even though it was fully charged. Near the foot of his bed, a shadow moved darker than the rest of the room, shifting unnaturally. Jack's breath caught as the shadow seemed to take shape, elongating into the faint outline of a man. Calhoun, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the dog tag in Jack's hand grew icy cold. He dropped it with a yelp, and as it hit the floor, the shadow vanished. When Jack dared to look down, the dog tag was gone, but a single word was etched into the dusty floorboards beneath his feet. Come. Jack knew he couldn't ignore this. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, and he was being drawn deeper into the mystery. The word etched into the floor, come, lingered in Jack's mind like a chilling whisper. The next morning, he woke to find the dog tag back on his nightstand, gleaming unnaturally, as if mocking him. He felt an overwhelming urge to investigate further, even as fear gripped him. Jack confided in Dean that morning. Dean, this thing won't leave me alone. It's like it's trying to tell me something. Dean gave him a skeptical look. Look, man, if this is some kind of joke, I'm not laughing. It's not a joke, Jack snapped, holding out the dog tag. This belonged to Private James Calhoun. I looked him up. He disappeared during a patrol, and no one knows what happened to him. Dean frowned, his bravado faltering. All right, fine. Let's go check it out after nightfall. But if I don't see anything, you owe me a beer. That evening, armed with flashlights and their rifles, Jack and Dean slipped away from the barracks and headed toward the jungle trail where Calhoun had vanished years ago. The air was thick with humidity and an unnatural silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot. Creepy as hell out here, Dean muttered, scanning the trees. Jack stayed silent, clutching the dog tag in his pocket. He felt its icy chill seep through the fabric, as if guiding him. After an hour of walking, they came across an overgrown path branching off from the main trail. Jack's gut told him this was the way. He glanced at Dean, who hesitated but nodded. As they moved deeper into the jungle, the air grew colder, the shadows darker. Their flashlights flickered, casting eerie shapes on the trees. Then, they heard a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like metal striking wood. What the hell is that? Dean whispered, his voice shaking. Jack didn't answer, stepping closer to the source of the sound. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, leading them to a small clearing. In the center stood an abandoned rifle, propped up right against a tree. That's an old M16, Dean said, his voice hushed. From decades ago. How is it still here? Jack knelt, inspecting the rifle. Near its base, half buried in the dirt, was another dog tag. He dug it out, brushing off the grime to reveal the same name, James Calhoun. The air around them seemed to thicken, the jungle growing unnervingly quiet. Then, the whispers began, lost forgotten comeback. The voices were faint but unmistakable, surrounding them from all directions. Dean raised his rifle, his eyes darting around. "Jack, we need to get out of here, now!" But Jack was frozen, staring at the second dog tag. He felt a presence behind him, heavy, cold, and unyielding. Slowly, he turned. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a figure in tattered fatigues, his face obscured by shadow. His posture was rigid, unnatural, as if he were suspended between the living and the dead. "Calhoun," Jack whispered. The figure tilted its head, stepping closer. As it moved, the tapping sound resumed, echoing like a dreadful heartbeat. Dean panicked, firing a shot into the air. "Stop," Jack yelled, grabbing Dean's arm. "Don't provoke it." But the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed deeper into the jungle. Jack felt the dog tags in his pocket vibrate, as if urging him to follow. "We're not alone," Jack muttered, his voice trembling. "He wants us to see something." Dean shook his head. "No way. Man, we're leaving." But before they could decide, the jungle seemed to close in around them. The whispers grew louder, the shadows darker, and the figure stepped forward, its face finally visible. It was hollow, empty, its eyes dark voids, its mouth stretched into a silent scream. Jack felt his knees weaken. "We don't have a choice, we have to follow." With no other option, the two soldiers ventured further into the unknown, the figure leading the way. Behind them, the tapping faded into a haunting silence, as if the jungle itself were holding its breath. Jack and Dean followed the shadowy figure deeper into the jungle, their flashlights flickering like dying stars. The air grew colder with every step, the dense foliage whispering secrets only the dead could understand. Jack clutched the dog tags in his pocket, their icy touch grounding him against the mounting dread. Dean's voice was tight with fear. "I can't believe we're doing this. Jack, we should have turned back hours ago." Jack glanced at him, his face pale in the dim light. "We can't. Not now. There's something unfinished here. Calhoun wants us to see it." The figure moved with an unnatural glide, its movements silent except for the faint rustle of leaves. As they walked, the jungle began to change. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their gnarled branches resembling outstretched hands. The ground became soft and spongy, each step sinking slightly as if the earth itself were reluctant to let them pass. They reached a clearing where the moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy. At the center stood a dilapidated outpost, its wooden beams rotted and sagging. A tattered American flag hung limply from a rusted pole, its colors faded with age. "This place," Dean whispered, his eyes wide. "It's not on any of our maps." Jack nodded, his pulse quickening. "This must be where Calhoun's patrol ended, where they disappeared." The figure stopped in front of the outpost, its shadowy form melding with the decaying structure. Jack and Dean exchanged a wary glance before stepping inside. The interior reeked of damp earth and decay. Broken furniture was scattered across the floor, and old maps clung to the walls, their edges curling. On one of the tables lay a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Jack picked it up, brushing off a layer of dust. The first few pages were illegible, the ink smeared, but one entry stood out. "Patrol compromised. Shadows moving in the trees. Supplies low. James says he hears whispers. He's not the only one." Dean shivered. "This is all kinds of wrong. Man, we shouldn't be here." Before Jack could respond, the air grew heavy, and a low hum filled the room. The walls seemed to vibrate, and the temperature dropped sharply. Dean's breath came out in visible puffs. Then, the whispers began again. "You shouldn't have come. Stay or leave. They'll never let you go." The voices overlapped, their tones a mix of sorrow and malice. Jack gripped the journal tightly, scanning the room for the source. Suddenly, the dog tags in his pocket felt like they were burning. He pulled them out, dropping them onto the table. They clattered loudly, the sound unnaturally amplified in the suffocating silence. The whispers stopped. The shadowy figure reappeared in the doorway, its hollow eyes locking onto Jack. Slowly, it raised an arm and pointed to a trapdoor hidden beneath the debris in the corner. Dean shook his head violently. "No, absolutely not. I'm not going down there." Jack swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "We have to. This is what he's been leading us to." Reluctantly, the two soldiers cleared the debris and pried open the trapdoor. A ladder descended into a pitch-black void, the air below carrying a faint metallic tang. "You first," Dean muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded, gripping the ladder tightly as he began to climb down. The darkness enveloped him, and for a moment, it felt like he was descending into nothingness. When his boots touched the ground, he flicked on his flashlight, revealing a narrow tunnel carved into the earth. Dean joined him moments later, his face pale and glistening with sweat. This better be worth it. The tunnel walls were lined with jagged rocks, and the floor was uneven, forcing them to move slowly. The oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing and the occasional drip of water. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small cavern. In the center was a crude altar made of stone, and on it lay several dog tags, their surfaces tarnished and scratched. Surrounding the altar were skeletal remains, their bones tangled in grotesque poses. Dean gagged, covering his mouth. "Oh my God, what is this place?" Jack approached the altar, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The dog tags seemed to glow faintly, their inscriptions barely visible. He picked one up, reading the name. Private James Calhoun. The moment he touched it, the cavern trembled, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You found us. Finish what we couldn't. Free us." The shadowy figure appeared once more, standing behind the altar. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into Jack's soul. It raised its hand, gesturing toward the bones. Jack's mind raced. "They want us to bury them. To give them peace." Dean's voice was frantic. "Are you insane? We need to get out of here." But Jack stood firm. "We can't leave them like this. This is why they've been haunting me. This is why the dog tag kept returning." With trembling hands, Jack began gathering the bones, arranging them as respectfully as he could. Dean reluctantly joined, his face twisted in fear and disgust. As they worked, the whispers softened, their tone shifting to something almost grateful. When the last bone was placed on the altar, the cavern filled with a blinding light. The shadowy figure stepped forward, its form becoming more solid, more human. It was James Calhoun, his face no longer hollow but filled with a peaceful resolve. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. Then he faded into the light, along with the other dog tags and remains. The cavern grew silent, the oppressive air lifting. Jack and Dean exchanged a look, their expressions a mix of relief and disbelief. Without a word, they climbed back up the ladder, leaving the haunted past behind. But as they emerged into the jungle, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching. Jack and Dean emerged from the jungle, the cool night air wrapping around them like a shroud. The oppressive tension of the cavern had lifted, but neither could shake the lingering sense of unease. The barracks came into view, its weathered exterior bathed in the pale glow of moonlight. Dean broke the silence, his voice low and shaky. "We did what they wanted. Why does it still feel like we're not done?" Jack didn't answer, his mind churned with questions, each more unsettling than the last. As they approached the barracks, he stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on the building's front steps. The dog tag, the very one he had left in the cavern, was lying there, glinting in the moonlight. Dean's face drained of color. No, that's impossible. We left it. We buried them. You saw it." Jack hesitated, then bent down and picked up the tag. It was ice cold to the touch, the name James Calhoun still etched into its surface. Beneath the name was a new inscription, one that hadn't been there before. The curse remains. Jack's stomach turned. We didn't break it, we only uncovered it. Inside the barracks, the atmosphere was different, heavier, darker. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, and the air smelled faintly of earth and decay. The other soldiers were gathered around a table, their faces etched with concern. "Where the hell have you two been?" asked Sergeant Martinez, his tone sharp. Dean opened his mouth to explain, but stopped when the lights flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon through the windows. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying with it the sound of distant whispers. "You've seen too much. They won't let you go. The curse feeds." The whispers grew louder, overlapping and blending into a haunting cacophony. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Jack gripped the dog tag tightly, his voice firm. "We need to leave this place, now." But before anyone could move, the room's temperature plummeted, and a shadowy figure materialized in the corner. It was Calhoun, or what was left of him. His translucent form was twisted and fragmented, his face a mask of anguish. "You were never meant to find us," Calhoun rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. "The curse binds us here, and now it binds you." Martinez stepped forward, his weapon trained on the apparition. What are you?" "I was a soldier," Calhoun replied, his tone bitter. "Just like you. But this place, it's a trap. It feeds on fear, on death. We were the first, but we won't be the last." The room trembled, the walls creaking as if under immense pressure. The shadows deepened, and one by one, the soldiers began to see figures emerging from the darkness, faces they didn't recognize, but all bore the same hollow, haunted expression as Calhoun. "They're all the others," Dean whispered, his voice barely audible, "the ones who never made it out." Calhoun's form began to distort, his features flickering between human and something monstrous. "Run," he growled, "before it's too late." The room exploded into chaos. The shadowy figures lunged toward the soldiers, their hollow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Jack grabbed Dean by the arm, dragging him toward the door. "Move," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the panicked cries. They burst out of the barracks and into the open air. But the nightmare wasn't over. The jungle seemed alive, its branches clawing at them as they ran. The whispers followed, relentless and deafening. Behind them, the barracks were consumed by darkness, the shadowy figures pouring out like a swarm. Dean stumbled, nearly falling, but Jack pulled him back to his feet. "Keep going, we have to get to the clearing." As they reached the edge of the jungle, the whispers suddenly stopped. The oppressive weight lifted, and the world around them grew eerily quiet. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jack looked down at his hand. The dog tag was gone. Dean noticed and let out a shaky laugh. Maybe it's over, but Jack wasn't so sure. In the distance, faint and almost imperceptible, he could still hear the whispers. "The curse remains." Jack and Dean sat in the clearing, the jungle behind them eerily silent. The faint whispers had stopped, but the oppressive tension still lingered. The moon hung high, casting long shadows across the clearing. "I can't believe we made it out," Dean muttered, his voice trembling. Jack didn't respond. His mind raced with thoughts of the dog tag, the shadowy figures, and Calhoun's warning. Something still felt unfinished. "We need to report this," Dean continued. "The others need to know about that place." But Jack shook his head. "Who would believe us? They'll think we've lost it." Dean opened his mouth to argue, but froze when a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing. The temperature dropped sharply, and Jack instinctively reached for his rifle. The jungle seemed to come alive around them, the shadows deepening as a figure stepped out from the darkness. It was Calhoun again, his translucent form flickering like a dying flame. "You thought you could escape." Calhoun's voice was a guttural rasp, filled with pain and anger. Dean stumbled backward, his eyes wide. "We left the tag, we buried the bodies. What more do you want?" Calhoun's face twisted into a grimace. "It's not about what I want. It's about what it wants. The curse isn't mine to end." Jack stood his ground, gripping his rifle tightly. "Then how do we stop it?" "You can't," Calhoun replied, his form growing darker, more monstrous. "The curse feeds on fear, on death. It's tied to this land, to the blood spilled here. It won't let you go, not entirely." The shadows around them began to move, taking on twisted, humanoid forms. The figures from the barracks emerged, their hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Dean's breathing quickened as he pointed toward the apparitions. "Jack, we've got to get out of here." But Jack didn't move. Instead, he locked eyes with Calhoun. "If it won't let us go, then why warn us? Why tell us anything at all?" Calhoun's expression softened, his human features briefly returning. "Because I was like you, once desperate to find a way out. But there isn't one. The only thing you can do is survive. And hope it doesn't take you completely." Before Jack could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The shadowy figures lunged forward, their ghostly hands clawing at the air. Jack and Dean turned and ran, the jungle closing in around them. Branches seemed to reach out, snagging their gear and tearing at their uniforms. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. "You can't run. You belong to us. The curse is eternal." Dean tripped, falling to the ground with a cry. Jack spun around, grabbing his friend and hauling him to his feet. "We're almost there," Jack shouted, though he wasn't sure where there was. They burst out of the jungle onto a dirt road, the sudden openness disorienting. Ahead, the dim glow of their base camp was visible, a beacon of safety. But as they approached, they realized something was wrong. The camp was eerily quiet, its lights flickering. The soldiers stationed there were gone, their tents and equipment abandoned. Dean's voice shook. "Jack, where is everyone?" Jack didn't answer. He stepped cautiously into the camp, his senses on high alert. Then he saw it lying in the center of the camp was the dog tag. This time, the name had changed. It read, Jack Harris. Jack stumbled back, his blood running cold. No, this isn't possible." Dean picked it up, his hands trembling. "What does this mean? Jack, what does this mean?" Before Jack could answer, the whispers surged again, louder than ever. The shadowy figures emerged from the jungle, surrounding the camp. Calhoun appeared once more, his form flickering and unstable. "It's over," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "You can't escape. The curse has claimed you." The shadows closed in, their icy grip pulling at Jack and Dean. The last thing Jack saw was the dog tag in Dean's hand, the name glowing faintly in the darkness. Then everything went black. Weeks later, a new squad arrived at the camp to replace the missing unit. While setting up their gear, one of the soldiers found a dog tag lying in the dirt. It read, Dean Carter. The soldier frowned, turning it over in his hand. "Who's this? I don't recognize the name." Another soldier shrugged. "Probably someone who used to be stationed here. Just toss it aside." But, as the new unit settled in, they began to notice strange things, a chill in the air, faint whispers in the night, and the dog tag, always finding its way back to them. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.